This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. And welcome back to the City of God podcast, where we are weekly talking about today's biggest cultural issues, all through the lens of God's infallible word. I'm Rob Pacienza, and today, joined by my good friend and somebody that you've seen on the City of God podcast before, Dr. Joel Satterly, who is the headmaster of Westminster Academy, the largest ministry of Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church, founded in 1971. Joel, welcome back.
Great to be back, Rob. Thanks.
So much to talk about in the area of education, and I know it's something that it does seem like it's on everybody's mind right now. It's making the headlines in the news, and even when we were off camera, you've really mentioned just this pushback recently that we've seen on education and public education in particular. What does that tell us about the mood and the tenor of the American public?
Yeah, it feels like it's swinging back. Can we use common sense as a measure anymore? I mean, people, we used to talk about that, but it feels like there's been a repudiation of the far left swing and agenda. And you can see it with parental rights being argued for again in the public schools a lot. You know, school board meetings, for example, you see it all over the news. We were just talking about in our own state, the legislature moving toward charter schools, which are technically part of the public school, but it's their kind of way of bringing education back to the parents and creating that space. So I think there's a general shift in the right direction.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about the rejection. What in your opinion, what is the American public rejecting? Is it the anti-American narratives? Is it the critical race theory? Is it cultural Marxism? All the above? What exactly are they pushing back against?
Probably yes, I would say to all of that. Right? We would agree, but our good friend Al Mohler talks about the closer something is to its created intent, the more effectively it works, or the converse, the further away, the more ineffective. And that's what seems like it's happening. It looks to me like that we're moving back toward the way things are. And, we want to pretend, so whether it's, the issue of gender, for example, I just saw in the paper where Clemson has on their application, and our students are getting all their college acceptances right now, 15 different genders you can place on the application. And so we can say that there are, it doesn't make it so, right? And I think people are now saying, wait a minute, this is crazy. It's not sustainable. It doesn't work.
Yeah. Maybe for our younger families that might be listening and they're thinking they're not in a Christian day school like Westminster Academy. They're still plugged into the public school system. I think there was, maybe I'm wrong about this, but there was for a period of time, as long as they're in public preschool or elementary school, it's safe. I'll wait to go to private school or Christian day school when we get to middle school and high school. But how are we seeing, you mentioned the gender ideology, the gender madness. How are we even seeing that in early childhood?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're right. And that was early in my career, that's what people said.
Yeah. Public school safe as they're young, as they get older.
So if we go back and, R.C. Sproul and others talked about the ideas have consequences, right? So if we go back, say, 20 years ago, the National Association of NEAYC, the national organization that kind of governed early childhood education, started changing curricular standards and accreditation standards to become incredibly more progressive. And people didn't notice it at the time, but we're now experiencing some of that. So for a good example of that would be a number of states, teachers are required to refer to students in the way students tell them to, and not to tell parents, not to have those where in my career, it's always been about interacting with the parents. So somebody said to me recently, the only people that have First Amendment rights in the public school these days are the kids. Teachers don't, parents don't, administrators don't, only the students.
Wow. So let's talk about the parental rights issue. I mean, you've spent your entire career as a headmaster and administrator in the Christian day school world. and you are approaching every day your leadership decisions, how you're running Westminster Academy from this concept of the covenant family matters, is critical. So how do you see the pendulum swinging back in the area of parental rights and why that is absolutely critical to a flourishing society?
Well, the family is one of the fundamental building blocks, right? God has given us family, one of his divine institutions, right?
Sure.
In fact, the first one.
Yep.
We see it. So we're back to that created order issue.
Sure.
And, history would show that the traditional nuclear family is the fundamental building block of any society.
Yep.
We also see the opposite of that when different governments or ideologies attempt to force an agenda. One of the places they go for are families and the kids. We got to get the kids.
Sure.
Right. So we've seen it in, say, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. I mean, the list. We've seen it.
Oh, it's foundational to the Communist Manifesto.
100%.
Yeah, we get the family, we change the world.
That's right. That's right. So we see that, and God, we understand that God has given children to parents to steward.
Yep.
And parents then look to the institution of the school to help with part of their responsibility.
Yeah.
And the agendas and the core values of those schools really dictate how that goes. And so a lot of parents are realizing, I think, that have been in the public school, that, wait a minute, our values are not aligned.
Sure.
They're kind of waking up and saying, wait, enough is enough. This is too far dissonant.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you could, look at our church in particular and our school. There is this sense in which we are doing our best to push back against the modern attempt to outsource education, and even on the church side, discipleship. I'm outsourcing discipleship and education of my child to these institutions. And once again, we need to push back, and we're fighting against that internally as well, and communicating to our covenant families at the church and our covenant families at the school. You are the primary educators and disciplers of your children.
Right.
We are partners. And how different is that from kind of what we're seeing in our secular culture and the public school movement?
Right. So in the public schools, you see it's the teachers. Parents are not welcome.
Yep.
Whether you see the footage of school board meetings where parents are thrown out,
Yep.
arrested, escorted out.
Yeah.
That's the grossest version of it.
Sure.
But just the general sense of they're no longer your children, they're ours. And that's really dangerous and scary, and contrary to, how God has set this all up.
Right. Another issue that we're seeing a lot of pushback, another area we're seeing pushback from the American family is this idea of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And just for the record, I think I can speak for you. We're all about diversity.
100%.
Yeah. The question is, how do we achieve it? Social justice versus biblical justice. But the modern secular movement of DEI, kind of the pushback that's even coming from the Trump administration, how does that affect education at both your level and institutions of higher education? Yeah.
So one of the things that happens, we know this, is policies or ideas happen, and then it takes a while for those to work their way out into the actual mechanics.
Yep.
So we're seeing that some of those ideas continue on in public policy. So if you take the recent controversy, for example, at Harvard, we've talked about Harvard before. They're kind of an easy target. They continue to make themselves that way. The whole anti-Semitic issue is certainly one worth talking about, but more significantly, the manner in which it's interesting. The federal government has been very, historically, very vocal about, if you take our money, we get say. That's so Christian day schools, for example, generally just sit that out. Historically, we've said no. Harvard takes as much federal money as any institution in the country, and all that's happening as I see it, is federal government is saying, well, you take our money, we actually get a say. Why does that? Why, that's been okay when it's dealt with Christians. Why is it not okay? Converse, and that's what we're seeing is it's so inconsistent because it's not part of the created order.
Sure.
And so of course it's dysfunctional.
Yep. Absolutely, and we're seeing the fatal flaws.
Right.
Sometimes it takes decades to see it, but this is not something new. This has been happening for decades, particularly in the institutions of higher education.
Right, and maybe one way to think about it is the previous administration, particularly their dogged pursuit of this, has pushed some of the DEI and some of the other social agendas to its logical conclusions, which is bankrupt. And we're seeing that perhaps that's even a blessing in a sense, that instead of us having to howl about it,
sure,
it's now patently obvious to everyone. And that's perhaps common grace in that regard.
Joel, America consistently ranks very low in global education standards and rankings. Can we make any connection to how we have turned the classroom from education to indoctrination?
Absolutely. And I think, look, people are going to look at those statistics, Rob, and some are going to say, well, Finland is a much smaller society and a generally homogenous one. Is that a fair comparison? And, I'm not a statistician, but you can make those arguments, right?
Sure.
But set that aside. Let's set that aside. To the point you're making, if you look at the history of American public education, you can see the shift. It's subtle, but you can begin to see the shift over time of how we moved from a focus on education, basic literacy, actually, or initially literacy to read the scriptures, oddly enough, but a basic literacy was the original attempt, to dealing with needing to socialize over time. In that socialization, helping Americanize immigrants, in the early 20th century, and then as that shifted on, that inevitably flows to indoctrination, particularly when married to some of the bigger ideas, the SOGI ideas that are being pushed. And so we see that. And so what happens is we're not teaching math anymore. We're not teaching how to diagram a sentence or what is a prepositional phrase. We're rather saying, well, we can't tell you that you're wrong because that might damage you. Right. So it's a whole different, it's an ideology. It's a forced ideology rather than education.
Yeah. Interesting. Let's go back to Harvard. Let's pick on them again.
Okay.
So you mentioned Harvard. You talked about the anti-Semitism. Trump recently decided to freeze federal funding in light of the violence and anti-Semitism that was seemed tolerated, and if not, maybe even in some cases promoted by faculty and other leaders of student organizations. Just any feedback, any thoughts on the decision to freeze funding?
Well, you saw that at Columbia too.
Yep.
Initially, Columbia was the first place I think that became really obvious.
Sure. Which makes sense. That was the birthplace of cultural Marxism in America.
Right.
When they came over.
So it worked itself out, and so Columbia was kind of the test case, and we saw it cost the president of Columbia had to resign, and so we saw those consequences. Again, we're back to, as we were saying before, in actuality, the federal government's being consistent. What the Trump administration is doing is they're being consistent with previous administrations and saying there are strings that come with federal dollars. That's essentially what they're saying.
Right.
Which has always been what's said.
Yeah, and why some schools choose to decline the federal funding.
Like Hillsdale, for
example,
right? But they're not doing it. I don't understand the outrage. They're simply, hey, this is the way.
There's expectations that are tied to the funding.
Of course, and it's always been that way. So I think it's the appropriate move to make. What's good for the goose is good for the gander, they say. But it's actually consistent. And I just struggle to understand the moral outrage that are Harvard. Now, there are probably limits to where the federal government, we would say as Christians and with a Christian institution, that there would be places of government overreach. That's too far. And so, perhaps, you could make an argument as to where to draw the line for the government saying, wait a minute, we get a say. And people can debate that. But I don't think the Trump administration, in this case, is doing anything different than has been historically done.
Joel, there are so many things that we could point to as if we fix this or we fix that this will be the answer for the hope for the next generation. But as somebody who's committed their career to education, why is the battle over education such a critical battle for the next generation?
Hearts and minds, right? I love to talk about the 16,000 hour proposition, which is just the amount of time students spend in school. So schools have the means, motive, and opportunity.
Yeah.
And so what a school believes, espouses, and aims toward really matters. And so I think that's true. We also, children are our future, right? We also know that it's the next generation. It's why I love Psalm 78. There's this really, the first 8 verses. There's this rolling out of a progression from information being given, shared, to actually the educational process of that becoming effective in people's, for students or children. And or a different way of saying it would be, if our children didn't matter, the other side wouldn't care about them.
Yeah. Joel, you talk a lot about biblical worldview at Westminster Academy. You wrote your doctorate on biblical worldview in the Christian Day School. First, give us a brief definition of what it means to have a biblical worldview.
So start with a worldview. First, my simple way of saying a worldview is a lens. It's just the way in which it's a filter. We take information in and then we make sense of it.
Yep.
A biblical one is an intentionally thoughtfully constructed grid that aligns with Scripture.
Yeah.
So that we're seeing what we see or experience, and how do we make sense of this through
And we often talk, everybody has a worldview.
Right.
Right. It's not a matter of whether it's what's informing it, what's grounding it.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So I think when a lot of Christians hear biblical worldview or biblical worldview in school, for instance, they might go, that's great. You have a class on worldview. But when your approach is, no, it informs all of education. It informs math and science and art. Explain that really the difference between, we're not just talking about having a class on biblical worldview, but it's shaping all of education.
Absolutely. So organic is a word I might use, because I think it is from the ground up.
Yep.
So we can't compartmentalize. There's a mistake that sometimes Christians make, that they're sacred and secular. We can't compartmentalize, right? So if we're going to think biblically about government, we also think biblically about art or math or the rest. We can't just cherry pick.
Sure.
We have to work that out.
Yep.
And that's also how the gospel works. The gospel doesn't just impact a piece of us.
Right.
It impacts all of us.
Doesn't just tell us how to get to heaven one day.
That's right. And so and truly, the other thing about biblical worldview I'd offer is, and I see this often left out when people talk about it. A true biblical worldview has to be rest on the foundation of the gospel. It has to land in hope, because without that, it's just another set of rules or another way of thinking about things. It's not active.
Sure. Yeah, that's good. That's good. At Westminster Academy in particular, you've launched the Worldview Institute. Explain to our listeners, what does that look like, and how is that a tool and an instrument for helping to equip your faculty and staff? So
it's a training program for our faculty, and we're fortunate to partner with the Institute of Faith and Culture, that you've led, and very grateful for that partnership. But it's a concerted effort that all of we started this way, essentially, with this. Let's not assume what our faculty understands. So we started from the beginning and developed a year-long training program that rest around just start at the beginning. What is a worldview? What's a biblical one? What does it look like? And then ends in practical application. And so we have taught that to our faculty. We teach the cadre of new hires every year. I personally lead that. That's how important it is to our school. Everybody has the opportunity to write a reflection. They write their own kind of personal take on their journey to apply the worldview. Here's what it means, say, when I teach art or music or third grade, because we want them to understand the power of context. Yeah. And then worldview, we just don't go, oh, it's done, because to your point, it's impacted all the time. We have to cultivate it. So that's why we do things like attend Kingdom Come or an element of our ongoing professional development is worldview.
I love it.
Worldview maintenance.
Yeah, which makes Westminster so unique that would be part of your professional development. Yeah, it makes it special. I'm going to ask you a hard question, and the reason it's hard is I know our listeners might say, well, he's biased. But I'm going to ask you about the future of public education. Is there hope for public education in America, or is it so far gone that we're beyond the point of no return?
I think common grace gives us reason to have hope. So I'll start there. I'll be theological and start there. We're also redemptive people. And so we understand that God has invited us into this cosmic reclamation project. So I don't want to be too quick to slam the door on that because of what we believe theologically.
Sure.
Practically, boy, that's a heavy lift.
Sure.
I mean, so on one hand, philosophically, theologically, we can say yes, there's hope. On the other hand, you're hard pressed to see it.
Sure.
Because where teachers are being trained, what they're coming out of higher education with, so that has to change. Parents have to be willing to parent again instead of become their children's friends or caretakers or chauffeurs or butlers. So we have to see that change. I think our churches have to aggressively fight for this.
Yep.
And so can it happen?
Yep.
Would love to think so. The practical side of me wonders.
Yeah, I think that's fair. All right, so the young family listening, they're on the fence with Christian Day School. Make your case for why they should be thinking about a Protestant, emphasize Protestant, Protestant Christian Day School for their young children.
What do you want for the future of your children? What do you understand to be your responsibility and calling as a Christian parent?
Yeah.
I hear people say, well, our children, we're sending them into the public school to be missionaries. Well, my question to that would be, that's fine. What are you doing to train them?
Fair.
Right? We don't send adult missionaries out without extensive training. Most families I know aren't doing that. It's also, we're to train our children up in the faith. That's what we understand about covenant.
Yeah.
You can't do that in a place that is not just neutral. That's a lie. No education is neutral. It's all. So you can't do that in a place that's misaligned fundamentally.
Sure. Yeah. All right. Final question. The family that's on the other end and they're getting ready to send their child off to college. They have a junior, a senior. What counsel, what advice are you giving that parent?
I think about train up a child in the way you should go. I mean, the better translation, there's what's the bent of the child. That's how, we have three in two of ours. Our last child, our son went to Christian college. Other two went to public college. It has to do with the bent of the child, I think. Also, what are the opportunities in front of you? So just like all Christian day schools aren't created equally, all Christian institutions of higher learning aren't created equally either.
Yep.
The other emerging thing, I would say this to my colleagues that are leading Christian colleges and universities, you got to figure out the economics.
Yeah.
Because there's a stewardship issue here that when we're talking to families about the cost of higher education, that how we're structured really creates a barrier that, and I don't. That's their solution, not their problem solved, not mine. But I think that's a real issue. But it goes to what is the bent of your child. I think.
Yeah. Well, Joel, thank you so much for being on the City of God today.
My pleasure.
Let me just say, and I can say this because I'm not raising money for the church or for the Institute or CRM. I think this is a worthy mission to give to. You might be living in Wisconsin and you go, why in the world would I give to Westminster Academy? Let me just make the case. 50 years been training up world-changing, culture-shaping students that are sent out into the world. We happen to be in Fort Lauderdale, which might be one of the most progressive areas in the entire nation. So if there was a worthy mission on the basis of what we've talked about today, the future of education, give to WA, give generously. You can go to wa.edu to find out what they're doing at Westminster. Pray for Joel and his staff. But thank you once again for your friendship and partnership.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rob.
And that's all the time we have for the City of God podcast today. As I just said, if you're interested in information on Westminster Academy in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, go to wa.edu, pray for the mission, find ways to partner with them to advance this mission. And if somebody you know might be interested in Christian education and they happen to be in the South Florida area, please send them to the website. Also send them this the copy of this episode if they're interested in thinking through the implications of education and their child and their family. Please pass along this episode. And we pray that you were encouraged and inspired by today's conversation. And we'll see you back right here next week on the City of God. The City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. Visit us at cityofgodpodcast.com to access all of our previous episodes. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or anywhere you get podcasts. A full video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.